name's Mikey Stewart. This is me. I grew up in Hawke's Bay, moved to Auckland to study, and in 2017, I went through the Summer of Tech program. It's a really, really cool program, really beneficial for students and employers. So if you're not involved, I highly recommend getting involved with that. Through Summer of Tech, I got a job as a mobile developer at TradeMe. I've been there for about 3 years, and in that time, I've been growing my app development skills and my hair. Let's go over the basics of navigation with Compose using the navigation component. Before we talk about how to do it, let's talk about what it is, what navigation is. Navigation refers to the interactions that allow users to move to and from content within an app. Navigation is a core part of the user experience of pretty much every single app. And because of this, it's such an important part of developing apps. I'll be showing you how to achieve navigation using the navigation component, Android's first-party library, which helps our apps provide consistent and easy-to-use navigation. So after adding the required dependencies, there are 2 steps for getting your app ready to navigate. The first step is to create a nav controller. So using Remember Nav Controller, you can create a nav controller, and that will tie the nav controller to the composable you call that from. So when that composable is removed, the nav controller is removed as well. The second step is to create a nav host. So inside the nav host, you pass in your nav controller, define a start destination, and then add some composables to your nav graph builder. So those are the 3 composables there: home, search, and account. So to do this, you just define a route and a destination, and the destination should be a composable. One thing to note is, although I have strings here, it's recommended to define the routes as constants, so you don't have hard-coded strings everywhere. So to navigate to the search screen, for instance, we call navigate on the nav controller, and we pass in the route to where we want to go. So in this case, search. And then to navigate back, all we need to do is call navigate up on the nav controller. And that's something like what you'd get. It's as easy as that. Another thing to note is that you should pass in these calls to navigate as lambdas. So we're not passing around the nav controller. That makes testing a lot easier. How to navigate with arguments. When you add composables to the nav graph builder, you need to also define the arguments that we expect. So here we define a key for our data, and then we define its type. String is the default type, but there are a whole bunch of other types you could use if you want to. So here we are navigating to the item screen and passing in an ID as part of the route. Just like that. And these are all the types that are supported. There is a catch though. Although parcelable is supported, it's not actually recommended. The best practice is to pass in an ID, kind of like what we're doing here, and then use that to load in all the data that we need. But sometimes there we go. Sometimes it might not be worth setting up a data source and fetching some data when you only need a really small amount of data, and you probably already have that data, right? So in that case, we can pass in multiple arguments. It's basically the same as passing in a single argument, except we define more arguments in the root separated by slashes. Then define additional arguments in the list of nav arguments. If any of our arguments are optional, we have to define them slightly differently. So you see underlined in red there, we're actually defining the optional argument using query parameter syntax. And then in our nav argument builder, we need to define a default value or set it to nullable. Bottom navigation. This is a common Material UI design pattern. So you probably run into it. Yeah, this is what it looks like. And I'll show you how we go about doing that. So remember how I mentioned defining the roots as constants? Well, for bottom navigation, it's recommended to define each bottom nav item in a sealed class. This means we can define a root as well as any other constant data that we might want to use, such as a label or an icon. So here we are defining the root and an icon. So in the last talk, Michelle mentioned the scaffold composable. We are using this here. And inside the content, which is everything between the top app bar and the bottom nav bar, we want to pass in or compose a nav host. So yeah, create a nav host as we normally would. And for each of the bottom nav screens, we pass in roots that we've defined in those sealed classes. Next, we define a list of bottom nav screens. And then inside scaffold as another parameter, for the bottom bar, we create a bottom navigation composable. And inside that, we iterate over the list of bottom nav items to create bottom navigation items. And in here, we pass in the root and the label and any other data that we defined in those sealed classes. And this is how we navigate inside the onClick. It's very similar to what I mentioned before, but notice how we're not just passing in a root, but also a lambda. This lambda is a nav options builder, and it's used to customize how navigation will work. Here, we're setting two things which are recommended for bottom navigation. We set pop up to the start destination, so we don't keep building up a big stack of bottom nav destinations. We set launch single top to true, so that if the user spams the button over and over again, it's not going to keep adding that to the backstack. So what do you do once you're inside of a tab? You might want some more navigation like this. You'll likely need nested navigation. You could navigate to a composable, and inside that composable, like the home composable here, set up another nav controller and another nav host, and have a nav graph that's kind of encapsulated in that composable. But that's actually advised against. It's advised to have your entire nav graph contained in one single file. This is because it could get confusing if you had like parts of your nav graph in different parts of the code. And also, it's nicer to have all of your roots defined in the one place. So instead, you should compose your navigation like this. So inside your nav graph builder, you can replace a destination with a nested nav graph, which is what I've done for the home item there. And inside that nav graph, you define your destinations of that sub navigation. Final thoughts. You guys know the ad, DIY, it's in our DNA. Well, the same kind of goes for Jetpack Compose. Compose is built in a way that encourages you to do things yourself. For instance, in Compose, there's a built-in composable for progress bar, and you can modify that by setting the color, but anything else, you kind of have to create it yourself. Like if you wanted to change the shape or the thickness, you can't just set it like you would in XML. So you do it yourself. The same goes for navigation. You can do it yourself, and it's pretty easy. So here's an example of a simple architecture Redux, and I'll kind of like walk you through how you might think about doing navigation yourself. So imagine we have a state, and that tells us what the current screen is. So say we have the current screen set to reminders, and that view, or our view, is observing the state. So we can say when the current screen is reminders, then we want to compose the reminders screen. So we're on that screen and the user does an action. So they click add reminder button. And what that will do will change the state, and the current state becomes, or the current screen becomes add reminder. And the view recognizes that the state has changed and it knows it needs to recompose. So it runs through its code again, and the current screen is now add reminder. So we now set the screen to add reminder. And that's your navigation. So this can be quite easy for simple apps, but as soon as it gets really big, it might get really complex. So for instance, you have to manage a lot of things yourself, like the backstack. If you want to check out Compose or navigation for yourself, these are some really helpful resources. I will share the slides after this. That's me. Thank you.
Are there any questions for Mikey?
You tested. Hey, have you tested this approach with navigation with a multi-module project? No. Okay. Cool. It's all good. Yeah, Scott, questions?